Good evening, welcome to Villa Albertine. I am really happy to introduce this new museum talks, our series dedicated to French art and culture in American museums. Today, we are really honored to host Julia Martiari-Alexander, director of the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, and Joe Briggs, curator of 18th and 19th century art, for a virtual talk on the current exhibition on display at their museum celebrating Léon Bonvin and entitled Quiet Beauty, the Watercolors of Léon Bonvin. Both of them will be in discussion with our wonderful moderator, Faya Kosé. Faya is a scholar and educator whose interests range in era from the Paleolithic to the present. So that's very large. She started her career as a professor of art history in California and retired a few years ago as the head of the academic programs at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And at the NGA, she oversaw the internship and fellowship programs, as well as developed the weekly public programs. Faya's advanced degrees are from the University of California in Santa Barbara. And although her primary field is ancient art and her best known books on umber, all the books behind her are mostly about Cézanne. She's also published on the German modernist Sigmar Polke, Michelangelo, and on Paul Cézanne. Most recently, she contributed essays for the exhibition catalog Cézanne, the Rock and Quarry Paintings. She continues to be involved in many cultural institutions, serving on local and national boards, especially the DC's own Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens and the Archaeological Institute of America. Recently, she was elected as a member of La Société Paul Cézanne and also a fellow of one of the oldest educational charities in the world, the Society of Antiquaries of London. Julia, Joe, Faya, thank you very much for being with us today. I leave you now the floor for this very promising museum talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Denis. Can you hear me all right? I'm coming through? Great. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce the director first, and then I will introduce Joe Briggs, the curator for this marvelous exhibition at the Walters. Dr. Julia Martiari-Alexander has served as executive director and CEO of the Walters Art Museum since 2013. Now, that's 10 years. She's inspired by the collaborative work that she and the team at the museum do to create exhibitions and public and educational programs that connect with the wider world, the wide-ranging and diverse communities in Baltimore and beyond. In addition, outside of her Baltimore work, she is the president of the American Association of Art Museum Directors Board of Trustees. But prior to joining the Walters, Julia was deputy director for curatorial affairs at the San Diego Museum of Art, with stints there as interim co-director, as interim deputy director for education, and more. But before moving to San Diego, where I used to see her in California, she spent more than a decade at the Yale Center for British Art, and that is where I first met her. She was there a curator of paintings and sculpture, and at one point also associate director of programmatic affairs and exhibitions and publications. Meanwhile, teaching in Yale's History of Art department. Julia earned her BA in Art History and French at Wellesley College, her MA in French at New York University, and then her MA and PhD in the History of Art at Yale. Now, when I turn this over to Julia, she's going to give us a bit of a background on the Walters and the significance of the exhibition we're going to talk about today and celebrate Léon Bonvin. Julia.
Hi, it's so nice to see you. And I apologize to everyone that I have an Italian painting behind me. It's one of the great treasures of the Walters, the Ideal City. But I had a Zoom fail 5 years into Zoom. I wanted it to be French, but it's Italian. So you'll have to, it's just for another time. It is really lovely to be here tonight. This is the second time, actually, that the museum has been offered a program in this terrific series, in the Villa Albertine series at the French Embassy. These museum talks are extraordinary events, and I'm so honored that the Walters is back in this year. Last year, some of the curators and I presented a selection of our works by French artists, ranging in date from the medieval period to the present. And it was really an introduction to the collection. And I want to thank everyone again for inviting us back. And especially thank you, Faya, for thinking about the Walters and also your stewardship of this incredible series. Many of you, I'm sure, have been to the Walters Art Museum, but in case not, you can check us out online at thewalters.org. And I'll just give you a little bit of background on the museum. The museum, which is located in the center of Baltimore, has over, right now, probably a little bit over 37,000 objects in the collection. And those are from cultures around the world, and they span 7 millennia. The museum was formed by a gift of Henry Walters, who lived really until 1931. And his gift was of 22,000 works of art, 2 buildings, and an endowment. And he gave that to the city of Baltimore, quote unquote, for the benefit of the public. This foundational art collection was begun by his father, Henry's father, William T. Walters, who died in 1894. The collection really reflects these 2 men, this foundational collection really reflects these 2 men's individual tastes and beliefs about what was culturally significant at that time and during their lifetime. William and Henry Walters, they, like all American magnates of that moment, used their incredible wealth, their power, and their social connections to collect art that reflected and furthered 19th century worldviews that were largely based in the Eurocentric arena. This is also a period of time in which Europeans and Americans saw the height of human artistic production as a progression from ancient Egypt to ancient Rome to Greece, and then marching on forward up to their present day, which was really the time of the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists. Although these foundational collections were brought together, father and son, and much of it was actually acquired as contemporary art, which you will see today. What William Walters was buying was, in fact, contemporary art. The founders really built an encyclopedic collection, or a collection that reflected their encyclopedic idea of the world. But since 1934, the professional museum staff, with the oversight of a board of trustees, has continued to augment the collections in number and in scope. And we really opened as a freely accessible, full access art museum in 1934. These collections that we have on view in Baltimore, the international exhibitions that we mount, the loans that we often send to France and around the world, and the many, many various public programs that we put on really demonstrate our commitment to opening up and expanding the kinds of stories that we tell about the past, so that we understand how the past reflects our present, how it influences our present, and how it can, in fact, help us. Understanding the past can help us make a better future. Essential to our mission has been this commitment to special exhibitions, and that is includes a long history of French art, through temporary loans. The most recent, perhaps, that was a big one, was Feast of the Senses, Art and Experience in Medieval Europe. And many of you may have had the opportunity to come in 2001 to see Manet's still lives. What you'll hear about tonight is truly an extraordinary exhibition, or a set of works that were lent to an extraordinary exhibition at the Fondation Custodia. And I think you will be delighted to hear my colleague, curator Joe Briggs, talk about not only the process by which these objects came here, the objects themselves, but also the incredible partnership that we had with the staff and the really beloved, now late director, Herr, and his name is gone for me because he was just amazing. Anyway, So you'll hear from Joe, and I really am so excited to have you all here tonight. And I will turn it back over to Kaya.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's such a significant thing to see how the collections have expanded, and yet you still build on strengths. I'm going to introduce the curator of the show, Joe Briggs, whose title is Jenny Walters Delano, Curator of 18th and 19th Century Art at the Walters Art Museum. She has worked there, or where she is now, since 2011. Her published work focuses on European academic art and the history of collecting in the 19th century. She holds degrees from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, the University of Oxford, and Yale University. Critical to the work that we will hear discussed in a moment, she is the author of 4 articles on Léon Bonvin, including a chapter in the Catalogue Raisonné, that is the complete catalog of everything known about the artist, Léon Bonvin. And this Catalogue Raisonné, which I'm just going to, and which is unusual, Catalogue Raisonné and introduction for the exhibition, which was in Paris at the Fondation, and some of which is now in Baltimore. And it's a beautiful book. Amongst the other, I'm just going to go and show, not only has she done this amazing work, but I'd like to say a little bit more about her breadth of experience and exhibitions that she's worked on for the Walters. She was the point curator for, and I just chose 3, which range in date and types of objects. One of the most extraordinary was Fabergé and the Russian crafts tradition, An Empire's Legacy. I chose another one, Designing the New, Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Glasgow. And then I will show her a remarkable capacity, because she just completed recently a survey of the work of the brilliant Baltimore jeweler Betty Cook. So now we're off to Joe and Léon Bonvin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully you can all see that. Yes, thank you so much for that introduction, Faya, and to Denis and Manon for setting this up. As Julia said, this is an amazing series of talks, and I'm just so thrilled to be part of it. And just so excited to share with you the extraordinary watercolors by the French artist Léon Bonvin. I would say that these are a highlight of what is an incredibly strong collection of French art. I'm also very excited, as Faya mentioned, to share some of the new research that happened for the Catalogue Raisonné, which was published by the Fondation Custodia just last year, and the front cover is on the screen here. So this book project really goes back at least 6 years, but it builds on scholarly work that goes back much further. And I should thank my predecessor at the Walters, Bill Johnson, and of course the scholar of realist art, Gabe Weisberg, because they have been working on this artist since the 1980s. And my interest really starts much more recently with the first exhibition I curated at the Walters, which was in 2011. And ever since then, I've kind of on and off been thinking about this mysterious and intriguing artist. And as was mentioned, the publication of the Catalogue Raisonné coincided with this major loan exhibition at the Fondation Custodia. It has the same title as the Catalogue Raisonné, and I'm just showing the facade of the Fondation Custodia. If you don't know it, it's very close to the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And the Walters actually lent 33 watercolors and the only known oil painting by Bonvin to this amazing show. And we were very happy to install 17 of those watercolors that came back from the exhibition in our Silver Gallery at the Waters under a different title, Quiet Beauty, the Watercolors of Léon Bonvin. And you can see this exhibition until the 13th of August this year. And I should also say that we have digitized all of Bonvin's work, and it can be seen on our website. And those images are high resolution and zoomable. So if you're intrigued by what you see, I encourage you to come to the museum. And if you can't make it, please go to our website and have a look at those wonderful images. But who is Léon Bonvin? So perhaps before we did this book and exhibition, I would have said that he was the most intriguing and unique French artist that you've never heard of. But hopefully we are now changing that by making his name a little better known. I'm showing you here a self-portrait that he dedicated to his wife and children in 1866, very shortly before he sadly took his own life. And this was when he was still only in his early 30s. And his short life is perhaps one reason that he is not better known. But also during his life, he never exhibited his work. And he had to work for a living. He worked in his family's bar outside Paris to support his family. So he was not in any way a full-time artist. His medium was specifically watercolor, which is cheaper and certainly more portable than oil painting. And I should say these watercolors are very small. They're really about range from about half to all of the size of a legal or A4 sheet of paper. So the watercolors which form a large part of his output were not particularly valued monetarily or seen as important in the 19th century in comparison to oil painting, particularly history or genre painting. And perhaps that's another reason for the artist's low profile. And Bonvin also depicted things that were accessible to him in his bar, but also in the countryside around it. And by looking across his work, you get a very intimate and personal sense of his everyday surroundings. So Bonvin produced only 90 watercolors in the course of his life, and 56 of these are at the Waters Art Museum. His watercolors fall roughly into 3 types of subject matter. And I should say, just a quick note, the titles that we're using here are from the Catalogue Raisonné. Bonvin did not title these works, so these are, we've tried to sort of standardize them with the Catalogue Raisonné, but they're not contemporary to their creation. So yes, these watercolors, they fall into 3 types of subject matter, and we have kitchen still lifes depicting vegetables, fruits, cruets, and dishes. And in this work on screen here, the still life with celery, you can see qualities that are really characteristic of his work. You get this high contrast between dark and light, a detailed depiction of shapes and textures, and a sense of immediacy, and almost like a sort of hint of animation. In this case, we have a very dramatic foreshortening of these celery roots, which reach out towards us and into our space. A second category of his watercolors are floral still lifes. And here we see a composition where a drinking glass serves as a vase filled with white and red carnations. And we see similar qualities to the kitchen still life. This is quite a dark watercolor, and we have these crisp outlines. These plant leaves seem to reach out into space. And if you look at the tabletop, you'll see little crumbs of petals that have been dropped, almost to give a sense of time passing and a sense of decay. And just a quick word here about technique. I'm calling these watercolors, but it's really a much more complicated situation. I think when we think of watercolor, we tend to think of a very translucent media where the artist kind of leans into the brushy and watery effects that can be created. However, Bonvin mixed gum into his paint, which makes it opaque. And he also uses a lot of black. Rather against the flowing quality of watercolor, he would outline these subjects that he's depicting in black ink, which give them a real kind of crispness. And I hope you can make that out in the detail that I'm showing on the right here. As I mentioned, if you zoom in on his works that are available on the Waters website, you can see more of this kind of mixed medium technique. So really they are mixed media rather than watercolor, but for the sake of brevity, we're going to refer to them as watercolors today. And then a third broad category of Bonvin's output are landscapes. But again, he takes a very unique approach. As you can see here, there's a very low vantage point. You see a detail of foreground plants that are very close to the viewer and very depicted in really great detail. But also we see great detail in the very far distance, where on the horizon you can often make out a church spire or a windmill. And in the middle ground, that hint of animation that we've seen in the other works by Bonvin come forward, because he often includes a working figure in the middle ground. And then also he would experiment with fleeting light effects, in this case, probably a sunset, but also moonlit scenes, which presumably were created from memory. So I think a central question here is, how can someone paint like this, given his seeming lack of training, his lack of time, and his lack of money? Certainly, the few contemporary critics who knew of Bonvin's work cultivated the myth that he was isolated and neglected, and that his genius was not allowed to shine forth. However, the truth is rather more complicated, and the essays in the Catalogue Raisonné work to contextualize Bonvin's work, whether within fragments of biographical information that have come to light, or through close looking. And really, we have to use our eyes to figure out and speculate on what sources Bonvin may have seen and what influenced him, because we do not have any written record of that. So I'd like to detail these new findings in the rest of the time I have today. But first, I want to expand a little bit on what Julia was talking about in terms of how it is that so many of Bonvin's watercolors have ended up in Baltimore. And as Julia mentioned, William Thompson Waters, was the father of our founder, Henry. He was born in 1819, and after he moved to Baltimore, he made a very large fortune in liquor, railways, and banking. Unusually for an American collector, he was purchasing and even commissioning French art from French artists before the Civil War. His collections eventually included works by Delacroix, Millet, Gérôme, Delaroche, and members of the Barbizon school. And he also had a very large collection of Asian art. So these were all gifted to the city, along with the many additions Henry made to the collection in 1931 on Henry's death. By the 1850s, William Waters had started to collect a significant number of works on paper, and he actually began his collection with a commission for 200 watercolors from Alfred Jacob Miller, who was a local Baltimore artist. As a supporter of the Confederacy at the time of the Civil War, William was forced to flee the country or face arrest, and he went to Paris. And here he continued to collect art, including works on paper by European artists. A fellow Baltimorean, George A. Lucas, was already living in Paris, and the two formed a business relationship to buy and sell art. And through Lucas, Waters was introduced to Bonvin's work. This led to commissions directly from the artist, and in 1863, William commissioned a dozen works from Bonvin. No other patron showed as much interest in Bonvin. And following the artist's death and William Waters' return to Baltimore, through George Lucas, he acquired another 30 or so watercolors, and his collection eventually totaled 56 works, or around 2/3 of Bonvin's output in watercolor. The year Bonvin died, William Waters commissioned a specially bound album to store the collection. And you can see on the front cover, William T. Waters' monogram, which you would also find on his porcelain if you visited his house. And he also commissioned a very special bespoke frontispiece and tailpiece from the French artist Jean-Marie Ragnier. And this tailpiece kind of was almost like a symbolic memorial to Bonvin, with the ivy and the brambles, and this palette kind of emerging from this broken plaque with Bonvin's name and the year of his death written on it. So William, however, did not stop there. 2 decades after Bonvin's death, he worked with Lucas and his contacts at Harper's Magazine to publish an article on Bonvin commissioned from the well-known critic Philippe Berti. And this came out in the Christmas edition of Harper's in 1885. And this was actually very clever because the Christmas edition was the one that reached the largest audience. Berti's article was accompanied by 9 wood engravings by leading artists working in this medium. So on the right here, we have Frank Wellington's interpretation of Bonvin's still life with pomegranates. And all the wood engravers who contributed illustrations to the Harper's article were members of the Society of American Wood Engravers, who were committed to sort of raising the profile of wood engraving as a democratic and particularly American form of art. And the wood engravings were widely acclaimed. They were exhibited at the Grolier Club in New York, and some won medals at World's Fairs where they were displayed. So in early 1886, shortly after the Harper's article appeared, William took some of his watercolors out of his album and hung them in a gallery, which were part of his Baltimore home. So this was clearly a carefully orchestrated effort to make Bonvin's work more widely known. To return to Bonvin, in many ways, the catalogue raisonné goes beyond the assessment of Bonvin's contemporaries, that he was neglected, fell into despair, committed suicide, and that his art continued to be undervalued. Already, we can see that William's interest in the artist rather undercuts this narrative. And we are now in a position to identify many diverse and sometimes unexpected sources that appear to have influenced Bonvin's work, and suggest that he was far more plugged into the Parisian art world and visual culture at the time. First of all, if we look at this comparison between Chardin's Still Life with Fish and Léon's watercolor of the same title, you can see many similarities in terms of the treatment of this subject and the subject matter itself. Chardin was undergoing a revival at this time in the 1850s and 1860s. French artists were turning to this artist's work to inspire their own paintings. And certainly Léon Bonvin's half-brother Francois, who's perhaps a better known realist painter, was also very much inspired by Chardin. This is clear if we compare Bonvin's Cook in a Red Apron with his half-brother's oil painting of a woman drawing water. Again, we see a similarity in the contrast of light and dark here. We also see a similarity in the pose of the women as they carry out their work in the kitchen. There's even the inclusion of buckets in both of these works, which kind of show how close the brothers' works were and how closely it seems they must both have been looking at Chardin's work. Another potential source for Bonvin's work, especially perhaps an inspiration for these highly individualistic watercolors that show these foreground plants, a very detailed horizon and working figures in the middle ground, could be Japanese prints, which were very fashionable at the time and were circulating as a kind of new trend amongst both critics and artists. and being used to really infuse a new way of looking and a new way of composing works into French art. And so here we see Léon Bonvin's Thistle in front of a winter landscape. And you see how these grasses and the thistle form a kind of screen in the near to the viewer. And then in the background, there is this horizon line. It's a little hard to see, but there are snow-clad buildings here. And this is actually a woman who is walking across the field carrying a basket. And this seems very similar to me to Utagawa Hiroshige's Iris Garden, where again, you have these plants forming a kind of screen in the foreground. This detailed horizon line here is kind of given this pink blush. And then in the middle ground, it's a little hard to make out, but these are also small figures that are moving through the landscape. So Japanese prints were also very influential on the French etching revival, which was another new trend that was current when Bonvin was working. And if we look here at Bonvin's watercolor of goldfinches, you see these little birds are kind of distributed throughout these plants, which are very close to the viewer. And then on the right here, we have Felix Braquemont's etching of, it's a little bit grotesque, some dead moles that are hanging from this little sapling in the foreground, very close to the viewer. And I think there is a similarity here between the compositions and to some extent the subject matter, which might suggest that Bonvin had also been looking quite closely at etchings. And we know that his half-brother Francois was also very involved in the etching revival. And then perhaps what is unexpected, perhaps the most unexpected source for Bonvin could be photographs. And we have a very brief mention in a contemporary source that Bonvin attended the École de Design, which was a free school set up to train designers for the industrial arts to design manufactured goods. And although it sounds a little bit strange, flowers were seen as an underpinning for geometry, correct proportion, and design. And a teacher called Ruprecht Robert was very invested in teaching students rules of good design by having them draw from live plants. And there's even a contemporary wood engraving of this school where you see little boys in smocks sitting around drawing plants in this top lit room. But another source, because plants unfortunately wither and die when they're cut and put into water, often a sort of economic shortcut, the students would draw from photographs. And Adolphe Braun created large-scale pictures of flowers specifically to supply this need in schools. And I think a very intriguing juxtaposition here is made between Bonvin's Vase of Flowers from 1863 and then this still life photograph, which shows very similar types of flowers. I think they're narcissus in this black and white photograph. This is a parallel which needs more research, but I actually stumbled across it just this week. I know that British watercolor was very influential in France, the work of Bonington. And I saw this watercolor come up for sale with a dealer in London. And this is on the left here, John Varley's picture of the Albion Chapel, which is a chapel in London, in the city of London. And I was very struck by how similar it appears to Bonvin's watercolor of the road in the Plain de Vaugirard, which was very close to his house. So I wonder if there might be a further avenue of inquiry, thinking about perhaps how the British watercolor tradition may have influenced Bonvin. So to conclude, in many ways, the unique qualities of Bonvin's work, I would argue, come from him being both very close to Paris, with artists visiting his family's bar, and a half-brother who was very well known within the art world. And the bar was also a place that could attract patrons like William T. Waters to him. But at the same time, he was far enough removed from Paris to have to fall upon his own personal viewpoint to draw on his own unique way of looking and painting. And so we find this unique blend in his work that really, I think, makes him quite different from anyone else who was practicing at the time, and clearly really spoke to William T. Waters, who ended up amassing this great collection. So finally, I just want to remember Gail Luchten, the director of the Fondation Custodia, who was such an amazing colleague and a great inspiration for both this exhibition and the Catalogue Raisonné. We dedicate our exhibition at the Waters to him, and we thank him for continuing William Waters' effort to share Bonvin's beautiful work with a larger audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. A wonderful talk, and I think you have brought some of these new ideas, the connection to the British watercolor tradition, in introducing us to think more carefully about the influence of Japanese woodblock prints with Hiroshiga, for example. It was a wonderful question. I want to encourage everybody who's with us, the 100 and more people who are doing it, if you have a question, go to the Q&A and type the question, and I will be able to read it, and if we have similar questions, I'll be able to put it together. But I have a couple of questions that came from having the privilege to go through the catalog and hear you today. But one of the first question came from somebody who said, so it was an inn and they had wonderful food. Do we know the names of the artists who went there to eat their famous dishes? I believe it has something to do with, well, you'll tell us more, but which of the artists do you know, or do we know, who went there and met him at the inn?
Well, it's a little difficult to be sure. However, there is a very interesting document which is a catalogue of a benefit auction that was put together after Bonvin's sad demise to raise money for his wife and his children, who were obviously, you know, thrown into a very bad position because they've not only lost their husband, their father, but also a source of income. So there was a benefit auction, and the Waters has one of the few copies that survive of that auction catalogue, and the names inside there would seem to indicate the artists that knew him and cared about him enough to contribute work to this auction. And it's a real kind of who's who of who is working in Paris at the time in the circle of kind of realism and etching revival. So we find Monet's name is there, Braquemont's name is there. There's a huge group of artists who seem to have cared about him. And given the proximity to Paris of this bar, it wasn't far out. It was kind of, you know, sort of suburban, I guess, almost location. And Mary Morton recently wrote a great review of the exhibition and the catalogue, and mentioned that she thought it was the dome of the Pantheon that was seen in one of the watercolors. So he was close enough to Paris to be known to these people, to be able to converse with them. I think what's challenging is that we don't have written documentation of those wonderful conversations that must have happened in that bar. I wish we could go back in time and find out. Yeah, I hope that answers a little bit.
I think in going through the catalog, and I probably had a good appetite at the moment, what were there were famous dishes that were served there, and that they raised their own rabbits. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, that's correct. In fact, the rabbits occasionally show up in the watercolors. I guess they were less squeamish about it in those days, and their pet bunnies would become pies. I guess they were guaranteed fresh at that point. But Bonvin was certainly this kind of character who seems to have been had multiple talents, that he was not only this great painter, but also this great chef. And we have also a written account that he also played the organ in this bar setting to provide entertainment for these artists who are coming out of Paris to see him. So yeah, it was quite a mixture of things going on in this little bar.
Yes, and I think the organ, just so that we don't imagine a church, it's a reed organ, and I think the idea of hearing Mozart and eating the special rabbit dish is quite something. We have a couple of questions, and so two of them are about technique, and one of them is, did Bonvin also work with gouache? And for some of us, you might need to remind us again of what is the difference between gouache and how we imagine a watercolor tray.
Yeah, so this is where I come against the limits of my knowledge to some extent, because we do have a wonderful conservation studio here at the Waters that I tend to rely on for technical information. But from what I understand it, it's by adding gum to watercolor, you get this thicker kind of paint where you can create something that's a little bit more like an oil painting. So as I mentioned, whereas in watercolor, the water evaporates and you're left with something that's quite thin or translucent, by adding these different kind of gummy additives to the pigment, to the water and the pigment, you can have something which is much more opaque. And that was how Bonvin was sort of be able to push that that medium of watercolor into a very different kind of look from what we would associate with watercolor today. I don't know if Julia wants to add anything to my attempts at technical art history. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that for us a little bit, the term gum is a little complicated one. Sometimes it's called gum arabic, and that it's, well, you might say it's something more like, and I have to be very careful, more like sap, and that there's a firmness that is in firmness to it. The gouache, so that you have more opacity rather than translucency, and that we see in these marvelous works. To see, and especially realizing how small they are. As one person comments, it's just amazing. The technique is utterly amazing.
That's right.
And so this idea of trying to explain more about the technique, part of it's difficult because he was such an individualist, as I understand, and that some of the things that he did, it was as if he was experimenting with them. So if you have anything more on that you want to say about that, I will just say it was wonderful to have the detail where you talked about the black ink line around this. Does that assume that there's a preliminary drawing and then that he makes a kind of ink and then he sort of expands and colors in? I mean, whatever you know or you think, Joe, from looking at it.
Yeah, sure. My understanding of it is, and you can see in some of the ones that are slightly paler in the areas of the sky, there was graphite underdrawing. I think the ink must have been added last. It has kind of browned over the years, so it probably was even blacker at first. And when I think about sort of parallels with other people practicing at the time, I mean, highly finished watercolors absolutely did exist at this moment. I think about John Frederick Lewis, some of the pre-Raphaelite artists were doing these very detailed watercolors, but there is something different about Bonvin's work, I think. And I think part of it is his mastery of the technique and his pushing it in different directions. And some of it is just the way he composes these works. I think the composition, that kind of foreshortened celery, it's almost like a Caravaggio rendering of celery, the way it kind of pops out into your space. And I mean, the pictures we have are great, but honestly, seeing them in person is really, the next kind of level kind of thing. So I think it's this combination of like just his technique is great, but it's then he's doing these really unusual compositions, like the foreground plants, the different times of day. It's really something that feels quite different, even from artists who were doing those highly finished works at the same time as him.
Yeah, I just had a response from somebody to clarify about the gum or gum arabic. Sometimes it's called gum acacia, gum sudani. It is a natural gum originally consisting of the hardened sap of 2 species of the acacia tree. However, the term does not totally indicate a particular botanical source. So by the 19th century, you could use others for it. So that's I think important. Another question we have is where else in the U.S. can we view Bonvin's work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I often wonder about William's eagerness to hoover up all of these works. In some ways, he did a lot to publicize Bonvin's work, but the fact that he had so many and kept them in one place means that we don't encounter them as we go around galleries in the US or even in France. There's a few works that are in Cleveland. The Getty has a few. The BMA actually has I think 4, because George Lucas, William's dealer's collection, ended up slightly circuitously at the BMA. And I think there might be one at the Morgan, but I'm not entirely sure. So and these are, if they are in other collections, we're talking like 1, 2, 4 is exceptional. Even the Louvre, and this is a little bit of a sort of brag on the part of the Waters, it does not own a watercolor by Bonvin. They have some of the earlier charcoal drawings, which are incredibly beautiful and very fascinating. And Guerre wrote about those for the catalogue Raisonné. But William really, I mean, it's a testament to William's incredible wealth and his incredible contacts on the ground in Paris, and George Lucas's sort of indefatigable tracking down of these works every time they showed up at auction, that William was able to just kind of get everything and then have it here in Baltimore. So yeah, you will see them around, but not many.
I have a comment. Thank you, Mr. Rodolfo Perez, for putting in a coda. Gouache involves adding chalk to the pigment. So we have, again, a sense of this flat as well as translucent. I have 2 questions in the Q&A, and both of them have to do with this very tragic suicide. One of them is, what do we know about it, anything leading up? And the second is there any indication of the nature of his physical or emotional state in 1866, which would have led him to take his life?
Yeah, they're great questions, and unfortunately we don't have a lot of written documentation, but what I can say is that there was speculation after his death that dealers had begun to offer him less for his watercolors, and that this had contributed to his depression and his decision to take his own life. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. The last contact he had with George Lucas came shortly before his death, when he actually returned some glasses to Lucas, which I assume to mean some of the vases that were being used for the plants. And I wonder if, my speculation is that was Bonvin kind of setting his affairs in order, because a few weeks later he did kill himself. We knew that he hung himself in the woods, and the very poignant thing that was said about him, and I think it was by Philippe Berti, was that the only damage he ever did in his life was to break the branch that was used to hang himself, which is like, people just, you know, that got repeated and repeated and repeated in all of the critical work about him, because he really was portrayed as this almost Christ-like figure, that he had sort of suffered and died because of this kind of neglect and abuse at the hands of the art market. I mean, we don't have diaries, we don't have medical reports, so the truth of the matter is probably lost to us. You know, our understandings of mental health have definitely improved, but I think there's always that central question of why someone would do that, especially when they were clearly so talented and had at least one quite generous patron. So it's a very sad situation, and unfortunately, there are things we'll never know.
Two other questions that we have. One of them has to do with did I understand correctly that William Walters went to the inn?
Yes, that's what we think. I should explain that a huge amount of the information about Walters' collecting comes from the diaries of George Lucas that were edited and published. And so we can understand kind of Lucas's movements and extrapolate some of Walters' movements. The problem with Lucas's diaries is that he abbreviates a lot. So he talks about Bonvin, and it's very unclear whether he's talking about Francois or Léon. So there is a lot of reading between the lines that we have to do. But yeah, it seems that William likely went to the bar as well.
Right. And then the second question is about the subjects of so many of his those phenomenal still lives. Is this mostly local, and in the way that he puts together what we might consider weeds as well as flowers, or is that? I would love to hear more about that.
Sure. It seems that most of what he was doing was things that were around him that he could find, that things that were growing around him. So you'll occasionally see a garden plant like a rose, but a lot of these things were wild. There's an interesting contemporary critic that writes that a patron, perhaps William, had encouraged him to paint more exotic fruits and plants, but that somehow Bonvin's innate tendencies were to paint things that were more everyday and more mundane. Again, that could just be an anecdote that sort of demonstrates Bonvin's rejection of kind of bourgeois sensibility. But yeah, I mean, I think it's quite clear that even the vases he's using are really drinking glasses. They're not actual, cut glass, Bohemian glass goblets or something. These are just meant to be drunk out of at the bar.
Yeah, I think in that same line of questioning about what he painted is to realize, as someone said, he painted what he knew with an extraordinary, and I have to say, when I went to the supermarket the other day, I was looking for celery roots and didn't find any, even at the organic market. But this capacity, and then this painting, as you compared to Caravaggio, that we are seeing it really from the roots upward. Were there plants when your various advisors told you what they were? Were there surprises for you as well? And could you also tell the seasons that these might be done from his observations?
Yeah, so we were very lucky that we had a chapter in the Catalogue Raisonné that deals specifically with plants. And it was incredibly helpful in trying to standardize these titles, which had really been added in a somewhat ad hoc manner by curators at the Walters Past who were just trying to identify things and put numbers on them in the 1930s. So there was a lot of sort of confusion. So it was great to get a little bit more clarity on the botanical names of some of the things that were there. I wouldn't say there was necessarily anything that surprised me necessarily in those sort of discoveries about what these plants actually were. It really did confirm, as you were saying, that these were things that were found locally. They weren't exotic blooms. These were things that he would have been able to find around his bar, around the countryside.
Well, Jo, thank you so much. We just have a couple of minutes left. So, Julia, do you want to ask a question or make an observation of what it's been like to have the shows?
I think it's a fantastic opportunity for people to come to the Walters if you can, because if you missed the show in Paris, as I like to say, these works don't get out much. They live very quietly in boxes because they are incredibly light sensitive. And so the last time we did a Bonvin exhibition of a different selection or a similar but very different group of works, it was 10 years ago?
Yeah, it was 2011. Yeah.
Yeah, 2011.
Upon arrival.
Yeah, that was her on arrival. And I have to say that all the shows that Joe does they're fantastic. But I think that that's one of the reasons that this Bonvin project, that our good friend Léon Legends, which is what I wanted to say earlier, but I was like, no, that's the architect. Okay, so that he really, it was his vision and one of his life's work to put on this incredible exhibition and create the Catalogue Raisonné. So it was really tragic that he died right at the moment when it was there. So if you didn't see it in Paris, please do come and see this show, because Joe has made a terrific selection, and you know, they won't be out soon. So
Julie, could you tell us about hours and access? Which days are you open and the hours, just to remind some people who haven't been recently?
sure. We are open Wednesday through Sunday. And most days we are open 10 to 5. We are open 1 to 9 or 1 to 8 on Thursday. So the only day that's different is Thursday, and you can come and have some great food. Baltimore is a great food town. And then come and, you know, have a date night at the Walters on Thursday.
Thank you very much. If we don't have any other questions, I'd like to thank again the Embassy of France, and thank very much Manon Simonon, who was our coordinator for this program, and also the cultural attaché, Denis Quenel, who has been so enthusiastic about the program and was really keen that we were able to do this in July, a few days before an important event. And here we are celebrating and thanking all of you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. À bientôt, j'espère.